Hello, everyone, and welcome to a short video here on some logic functions related to our current work. And so in this example, we're going to make a very simple, what I call farmer's market calculator. As you can see, I've got some text already entered into my spreadsheet. So I have the text farmer's market calculator here in cell B2, spills over. I've got my business rules over on the right. Again, as I said, business rules are all kinds of things that we might want to incorporate into our spreadsheet. Certainly, one of the things a business has the ability to choose is pricing. And so in this farmer's market calculator, we want to build a very simple cash register kind of application that's going to compute how much should the person collect based on how many packages the uh, customer is purchasing. And in this very simple business, we only have three items we sell: apples, bananas, and cherries. They have corresponding prices here that I've made nice round numbers, or two, one, and three. And so the math isn't difficult here. And if this was the pricing scheme in reality, hopefully the person collecting money wouldn't have to necessarily use a computer to do this. But I want to demonstrate a function that comes from chapter 3, which is a logic function that, just like the if function we learned in a previous example, allows us to automate a process and let Excel think for itself. And so when we think about building spreadsheets and spreadsheet models, one of the things we have to think about was what are the inputs that the user has to tell me. In most cases, if not all cases, there have to be some inputs or information given to the spreadsheet. And then there's going to be some kind of processing calculation that happens, and then an output results. And so in this case, the two things that our very simple calculator is going to need to know is what is the item that the customer is buying? And so I might put a label here and say item purchased. Obviously, the text there gets a little bit large, so I'm going to make that column wider. I'm going to highlight that in yellow to just emphasize to the user that that is where you want to put the entry in. And I might also have an entry because these things are in packages of some kind, and you don't have to buy just one package. Somebody might want to buy two or three or 10. And so again, we need to know how many packages of this particular item are they buying. And ultimately, we want to calculate the output, which is amount due. And in order to calculate the amount due, we're going to need to have Excel tell us what the price per package is. And so I'm going to add another item here in between the item purchased and the quantity. And it's going to automatically calculate. I don't want the user to have to type in and look on the list themselves and enter the price. There's a possibility they might make a mistake. They might overcharge. They might undercharge. We want to automate this. And when you go to a grocery store, when you go to a convenience store, we see this kind of thing happen all the time. They've actually automated it even further, where in most stores, the cashier scans a barcode. That barcode then looks up the item price and then uses that as part of the calculation of the amount due. In this case, we don't have the automation of a barcode, but we will use the name of the item. And certainly we could change the name of the item to some kind of generic item code, like a UPC code. And so let's imagine that I have somebody that wants to buy apples, and they're going to buy two packages of apples. Our amount due is going to be multiplying with a formula equals C5 times C6. What's the price per package times the quantity. And you'll note that I'm going to use C5 here, which is right now blank, because that's where I'm going to put the logic function that's going to automatically tell Excel and use the correct value for the price per package. I don't want to reference over to the table on the right, because the next person might want to buy bananas, and I don't want to have to update the spreadsheet to say, okay, now multiply by this cell instead of that cell. That's a lot of manual brute force intervention. And so I'm going to put in that calculation, which right now is going to show as 0. A blank cell times 2 is blank. But we'll make that cell not blank because we're going to use a logic function, and it's going to automate what we would do if this was pencil and paper, is we would look in this table over here. We would look up and down the list of items until we found what we want, and then we would look to the right. And in Excel, and in particular our book, chapter 3, they introduce one particular logic function called the Vlookup function. There are multiple functions in Excel that do similar or variations of this kind of thing, and we'll learn more about them in chapter 7. But VLOOKUP is the one that they choose to demonstrate first. And the VLOOKUP function is a function that has a particular pre-programmed purpose, and it has a very particular set of syntax. And so here we have to pay attention to, well, what is Excel expecting, and how do I make sure that I give it the right information, whether that's cell references or settings or other things. And so the first thing, if we look at after I open the parentheses after the function name, it tells me the 4 things that Excel is expecting in this particular order. The first thing is the lookup value. That is, well, what cell contains the item you want me to look up? And in this case, it is cell C4. It's the name of the item. And so we type or click cell C4. Then it asks, where is the table array? Table array is the location using cell references of the table that we're going to look up C4 in. And in our particular case, that table array is cell F5 through J7 or G7. It's that 6-cell rectangle. And Excel is going to look up the value in C4 in that first column. With a VLOOKUP function, it's always looking in the first column to find the appropriate row. When I put a comma, the third argument is column index number, which is always a bit confusing for students at first because column, index, and number are 3 words that you perhaps used separately, but you've never used column, index, number before or heard of that perhaps as a phrase. And what it really means is which column in the table do you want back? And it is literally looking for a number. The most common mistake students make is they try to say, well, it's column H. And it's true, column H has the prices we want, but that's not how Excel is thinking about it. It's thinking about it as it is column 2 of that table. And of the table we just defined in the table array. And then the last thing it wants to know is, do we want an exact match or an approximate match? And in chapter 3 of our textbook, we're going to be using an exact match, meaning that the word or the number or whatever it is that is the lookup value has to match the item in the table, the first column of the table, in order for me to get a result. And so in this case, I've typed the word apples. Apples shows up in the table. When I close that parentheses and hit enter, I know by looking at the table that the price is $2 a package. And when I hit enter, it will put the appropriate price and that number 2. I could format that as dollars so we can kind of differentiate which is the dollar amount and which is the quantity. But if I change C4, this function has now become versatile because if I type in cherries, cherries are $3 a pound. The amount due is 6. And again, I could format that. Again, the calculation is right, but I might want it to appear as $sign with $6.00. If I type in bananas, Excel automatically finds bananas in the table and says, well, they're $1 a package, and we're buying 2 packages, so that's $2. And if I type in something that's not on the table, if I type in cherry instead of cherries, I'm going to run into a pound NA message. And that is because Excel is actually looking for an exact match. In that VLOOKUP function, if I bring up the syntax, we said the last argument was false. And that means whatever I type into cell C4 has to exist in that first column of that table. And even though I know that cherry probably means cherries, Excel and computers are very exact. And so it looks for an exact match. And there are times where we might not want it to use we'll talk about approximate matches later on. Approximate matches are particularly useful when you're talking about numerical lookups. When you're looking up text, though, typically we might not want to use an approximate match. For now, we're not going to have to deal with that issue in chapter 3. It's always talking about exact matches. And so as long as I enter in something that is in the list of items in the table array, I'm going to get a proper calculation. And down the road, we'll talk about designing a spreadsheet and trying to prevent errors. In this case, we're dependent on the user typing in something that is a correct item in the list. In the workplace for retail cashiers, they don't have to type in the UPC code. They simply use a barcode scanner. You remove the manual error that way. And you've probably seen in web forms or other kinds of applications when you have a selection and you have to make sure you pick the exact selection, you might have a drop-down list. And so we'll talk about down the road. I think it's chapter 10 or 11, talks about user interface and actually having drop-down lists so that instead of having to type in the word apples or bananas or cherries, in this case, I could simply use a drop-down list. But that's beyond where we are right now in this introductory chapter. Our focus is on the Vlookup function, and the Vlookup function has a brother or a sister called HLOOKUP. HLOOKUP is a horizontal lookup, and again, the textbook pushes that off until chapter 7, but it's exactly the same thing. Instead of looking vertically up and down for the thing it's trying to match, it would look left to right. And so again, no matter what way the table of values is given to us, we can tell the computer to use the appropriate logic function to find a match or find the closest value and then give us the resulting set of values in return. And so VLOOKUP is the function they focus on in chapter 3. In future chapters, they also talk about HLOOKUP. For those of you that are using the more recent versions of Excel or have some exposure to it, there's some XLOOKUP functions as well that we might spend some time with at the end. But the idea is I can build spreadsheets that automate some of this lookup process. In this case, all of us could easily do the manual lookup in a very simple situation, but we don't want to have to spend the time doing that. And if I had thousands of rows of items and I wanted to do the appropriate lookup for a value in each of those cells in a column, again, I would write one VLOOKUP and then be able to copy that formula function up or down. And when you copy a VLOOKUP function, one of the things that you do have to pay attention to, and we'll have some activity in chapter 3 to kind of refresh our memory on this or keep us sharp on it, is that that table F5 through G7, that is a dedicated space that contains this information. And so if I'm going to copy this function up or down, left or right, I need to put absolute references on F5 through G7. Because otherwise, what will happen is that range of the table will start shifting, and pretty soon, if I shift far enough down or far enough to the right, it's going to be looking at blank cells, and I'm going to get some unusual, mysterious errors from that. And so again, the idea of relative and absolute references is one of those things that's going to show up again and again and again in all kinds of places. And eventually you'll get good at recognizing this is when I need to use this kind of reference, and this is when I might need to use a different kind of reference. But for now, in this simple example, we're doing one lookup. We don't have to worry about copying and pasting or dragging left, right, up, or down. We're simply focused on, well, how do I get that syntax in the VLOOKUP function to use the cell references to tell it what to look up, where to look it up, and then how to return the result. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, stay tuned for more videos.